we are seeing organizations rethink how HR works, which you and I have talked about a lot. Not just because what we do doesn't change. You still have to manage people, the roles, but how HR works. I think the biggest difference maybe that, and we're going to talk a little bit about later, is that HR might be shifting into their next big thing that I don't think they've really been able to ever get to effectively, is that they are managing work versus just the people who do the work, right? And we'll talk about what that looks like a little bit later in a couple other articles. But at the dinner that I had the first evening with Kelly and her team, and as well as a couple of founders, or a couple of investors and some CHROs, we had this great conversation about sort of what is the work of HR. And it was very clear that I think everybody had a different opinion about that too, and how much that was changing. And so it was good to see that I think people are not just improving on what we have these days or coming up with a new AI coach or a new AI learning tool, but they're really thinking differently about what work gets done within an organization.
Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Welcome to Spilling the Tea on HR Tech, where we focus on the hottest HR tech news everyone needs to know to be in the know. We break down the news of the week and help you make sense of what it means for our industry and how it can impact your organization. We're recording today, which is March 27th, 2026. Do you have your taxes done if you're in the United States? It's coming up pretty soon. We got Easter, I think, vacation for everyone, spring vacation, depending on where you're at. So it's a busy week for a lot of people. We're bringing you all the news that you can use this week. I'm your host, Stacey Harris, the Chief Research Officer and Managing Partner for Sapient Insights Group. We are a research and advisory firm if you haven't worked with us previously. And joining me today for the conversation is my co-host, Stevenson, Director of Research and Principal Analyst for Sapient Insights Group. Cliff, welcome to the show. What kind of tea do we have today? Is it a spring concoction? Is it?
Yes.
What are we doing?
You up for those taxes? I was getting a little nervous when you started off with tax day. I was like,
okay, maybe it's front of mind because I know I'm going to have to ask for an extension, right?
So we got relaxing sort of floral teas for the spring holidays, but also lots of caffeine, lots of excitement. It'll be pretty interesting today. We're going to be talking a lot about expansions to platforms. I feel like we recently did a systematic breakdown, a quantitative breakdown of everything we talked about in 2025 to see, there were certain periods when we saw a lot more M&A activity and then a lot more periods where we were talking about sort of the expansion of AI into other types of platforms than just the larger ones. I would say that, the first quarter we saw a lot of M&A activity, and it's interesting. Now we're seeing it of existing platforms, and I think that'll be reflected today in some of our stories. So lots of funding. Get your checkbooks out.
It's a pattern. There's pattern. Like no matter how much we try and get away from it, humans love our patterns. They sometimes break. We got a few of them that are breaking, but they do love our patterns, right? We also been doing a lot of traveling. So I just got back from the Transform event, and our team got back from the Unleash event. So we should just make a couple quick updates about that. We'll do before we sort of wrap into everything as well. And then we have a lot of other conferences and events we're going to be going to, but we're going to wait till the end of the show to talk about those. So, Cliff, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with our updates on the events, or do you want to jump right into the news today?
Let's start with the events. Just a quick reminder, if you're listening to this, by the time it comes out, by the time you're hearing this, we'll only be about a week away from, about 2 weeks away, but let's just go with that. The April 15th will be the launch through our distribution network. So if you are friends of one of our distributors or somehow affiliated with one of those groups, you may start to see our survey. Please take some time aside. I know you got, as we said, taxes to do, Easter holidays. None of that is as important as our survey. That comes first. Tell your family you'll get to dinner.
Working heavily on it this week, guys. He's a little biased today.
And then if you haven't seen it by then, that's all right. By the 29th, it's completely available. We'll do a reminder on the next show as well. But April 29th, it'll be out. So please take a look at that. We're going to be adding in finance. So if you are a finance professional or interested to see how that will all link together, we'll have questions for you. Send those on to someone you do know that's been wanting to see this continued integration of the finance role and the HR role. We're also going to be talking quite a bit in this survey about compliance. It'll be rather than sort of weaved in. It'll have its own dedicated section. So keep an eye out for that. At the same time, we've made it easier and easier as we do every year to use. We do keep an eye on the average amount of time people have to take and try and actually shorten that despite its length, so that you only have to like stay focused on the things that matter the most to you, and with questions, and hopefully gather you towards that information without wasting any of your time. Speaking of not wasting your time, let's jump in, as you said, Stacey, and talk about some of the ones you've been to, because I actually, and thank you for this, by the way, Stacey, me to you personally, thank you for traveling so much recently and being at these events. I know both of us have a big April ahead of us. We'll talk about it at the end of the show, but tell us about your various journeys and what you saw in them.
Yeah, so I did not actually go to Unleash, which was about 2 weeks ago, right? But our team, Allison Williams, went there this week, and Summer Orlano, who is in our growth and partnership area, and Allison is our new director of research programs, covering all of our various programs that we have in the organization, and joining us on the analyst track and analyst space as well. So we're really excited. One, that was Allison's first sort of event on her own. I know it's always kind of right. What we keep talking about, like, who's the next generation of analysts, right? Well, they're coming around. There was a really good, I think, commentary. I want to say it was maybe Jennifer McMillan, one of them, had put out a really sweet sort of conversation about what we're seeing come up in the ranks of the analysts and the market as a whole. There is a whole new generation of workers who are really sort of getting ready to take the reins in a lot of these things. So we did a couple of differentiations we saw between the two. Then the following week went to Transform. I had the opportunity to be on stage with the Clear Coat Company and their head of product and senior leader Arnaud. We really did get a chance to talk about, one, their big new branding, which we'll have a little bit more about later on this year, but also got a chance to really talk about how CHROs are preparing for the AI transformation and how they're basically doing that effectively or not so effectively. So it was a really, really good week. The biggest difference we kind of saw, and we're going to actually write up some reports on this, and so if you're interested in that report, let us know. Summer's doing that because she's been to both. Because there is this big conversation about can we handle sort of two big HR events in the spring timeframe, right? Used to be that IREM was the big HR tech kind of event in the spring timeframe that kind of left that space. Sherm had tried to put a couple of different events here. We know there's a lot of events in Europe at this time frame. I'm going to be doing HR Tech Europe in a few weeks as well. But they are sort of similar in sort of the things they're talking about. But Unleash definitely had, from what we understood, more of a focus on very large enterprise companies and the challenges that they're dealing with on a regular basis. Transform, to me, having never been there, gone there for the first time, I was pleasantly surprised. I didn't know what to expect. I thought the event had a really good vibe to it. A lot of mid-market organizations, CHROs, which I think is always a good positive for an organization, a lot of mid-market directors of HR, a lot of different industries, which I always like to see an event. So I think, it's a very fresh new approach that they're taking over the Transform event. I do think they've got to be careful. It's real easy to fall into the same patterns you see at all the other events. They have the executive roundtables. They had the tracks for a lot of AI. They had the innovation session. They've got, a lot of the same things that we see at some of the other ones. So one of the things that we're going to be talking about is sort of what do we do at some of these events that are a little bit different for each organization. But a couple of the big topics that I saw as takeaways across both these that, we've been sort of sharing our notes on is, one is that, yes, organizations are leveraging AI in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of great case studies out there, but what we are definitely hearing is there is a large group of organizations who are still trying to figure out how they just get their HR tech systems to integrate and work together. And they're really very frustrated with the AI conversation because it's not helping them actually get the work done right now, right? And so I think that's something for all the vendors to be aware of, is that you really need to fix their basic HR tech problems before you can dive into the AI conversation. And yes, I can do a little bit of that for them, but if we were doing a panel, one of the panels that I did, which was great, with Kim Seals and Vicki Thomas. Kim Seals is from West Monroe, partner over there, heading up their global HR and HCM practices area. And Vicki Thomas is a senior director at a company called TPMA, focusing on education and trade business models and how those two worlds work together. So how do we get businesses who have trade workers and education that have trade workers and government grants tied together? And that panel was interesting because not only did we get some great conversation about the fact that hey, a lot of these sessions don't meet my needs if I'm an HR professional here who are dealing with a lot of on the ground trades work. But there's also really interesting questions like, what do I do if I'm in a town or an area that does not have regular access to internet? That was still a question, right? Or if my business model can't have regular access to the internet. I think there are things we oftentimes forget that HR is dealing with that is way beyond the AI conversation. The other thing I heard very heavily this year across both these organization or events was the investment in homegrown developed HR functions. My prediction this year, Cliff, is that one question we have is, are you developing your own HR tech is going to increase in all application areas. I cannot tell you how many times I heard well, I just built this in Claude. Now, you and I both know that there are some real gaps there with security, some real challenges with building out, maintaining, keeping it up to date, having someone who maintains it. We had this great conversation with Arnaud that was really practical and forthright about, yes, you can build it. Are you going to pay the $100,000 for someone to maintain it every year? By the way, it's cheaper just to buy the application that we're maintaining, right? So, I do think people sometimes overlook the idea of building, but there was a lot of that this year. The other thing I heard a lot of is Claude is definitely the tool of choice at the business level right now. So that's something I think we're seeing come out pretty clearly, unless you developed your own or you have your own models that you're working on if you're a larger company. But for that mid-market space, Claude was definitely I was hearing a lot more Claude this year than I was ChatGPT previous year. And then, I think, we'll get into a lot of the new conversations here about what we're seeing in technology and tools. But I was really, I was surprised to hear how many organizations were still trying to figure out the data behind AI. And we're going to get into a conversation about synthetic surveys and synthetic data, what that looks like. Because again, mid-market, I don't have the big benchmark. I don't have a lot of companies. One of the people says, well, we benchmark things for people and they only had 80 customers, right? 80 mid-market customers. I said, you really been? We started this back in the big data conversation, and now it's happening in AI because you can't really use AI against a very small data set unless you're really good at what you do, right? So we're going to talk about sort of quality data versus big data, and we've had that conversation well. So that was the big topics, I think, at these events. There was also a lot of government announcements that we're going to get into too at Transform, which I thought was a very thing. Unleash had some really big speakers at it that I think people were very excited about. They did have a couple of big speakers at Transform, but I, as usual, did not get a chance to see all the speakers because I'm out running around talking to everyone. So we'll talk about some of the other people that we met throughout the event this today. So long way of saying it was busy. Oh, and then 321 Coffee. We did have that the previous week. That was even more important to me. 321 Coffee had its celebration of 321 Day. I will put a big post out about this week because I did not get to do it last week because of some personal things. But we did a blog on our website about it. If you are trying to figure out how to help your organization really create an inclusive work environment and leverage a workforce that oftentimes gets overlooked, follow our blog, read that thing. There is so much untapped talent in this market because we oftentimes overlook people who have the capabilities. So that's where I'll leave that. What else is going on, Cliff?
I know a little bit about 321 Story, and I was there for one of the days a few years ago. It's special to me, too. But I've already told you, don't make me cry during these things. So
No cry.
We do also have a couple webinars coming up that we're going to be in May. We'll be doing one with HiBob and another one with ADP. So we'll give you more details on next week's webinar, but just do keep that out if you're looking to get a little more in-depth into any of these subjects that Stacey touched on. In fact, we're going to be going into some details. So I'll just say, remember what she said. That was actually, I don't know, intentional or not, but a really good sort of primer for what we're going to be talking about today, because we're going to be revisiting a lot of those themes as we go. But first off is sticking with the AI theme, is that Findem, who we talked about just recently for some of their partnerships and funding and some of the changes they made. Findem is in talks to acquire or has acquired Glider AI. I'm trying to be careful for any of our attorney friends out there. But Glider AI, who we've also mentioned in the show before, does the AI-powered interviews and skill assessments. And what was interesting about this is, Findem being sort of in the candidate aggregation space. I think of it as a number one sourcing tool. I'm sure they would definitely go larger than that. And how they see themselves. They believe that not just the technology of Glider AI, so having that ability to do these AI-powered interviews and do those skill assessments and add them, but taking the already existing data that Glider already had. And they were very direct about that, of it being a technology plus data play, to use an exact quote from Glider's AI, or Glider AI's CEO. So pretty interesting, because obviously that is where a lot of the value is coming from. Yes, the AI tech is important. And like you said, Stacey, there will be more and more companies taking advantage of being able to sort of create their own with these tools. But there's no way to recreate that many data sets, right? That's something that's already been out there that you can then use as part of your ecosystem.
Yeah, I got a chance to speak with Liv Anderman, who's their CMO at Findem, while I was there that week. For them, I think that this was a big announcement. They also had I'd worked with them a while back, and they had a big partnership with Paychex, right? They grew pretty rapidly in the market as to sort of their status and what they're doing and their approach to sort of gathering the data and integrating the data in a way that I think people can access it from all of that candidate information, from all the possibilities and talent pools, right? There were a couple things that she let me know that I did not realize. That not only with the Glider acquisition does that give them sort of a deeper dive into that space, but they also had just recently sort of moved into sort of the contingent workforce space as well, which I think is a really important sort of connectivity and tissue, and the executive recruiting space as well, which again, I did not realize they were doing executive sourcing. I knew they were doing sourcing, and obviously executives fall into that space, but they actually have services that are more wrapped around that, which is generally a much higher level of service. But they put tech to that, which I think was an interesting thing, because I have not heard about tech to the executive services space, right? So that was really interesting to see that announcement come out, and to hear them talk about sort of the investments that they're getting in this space. I know there was a couple of dinners and events that they threw. There was a lot of noise around what Findem was doing, but it was good to talk to Liv. We haven't had a chance to catch up in a while, and I am excited to kind of see where they take this. You and I both know that the tech itself is not really as people are building tech pretty quickly these days. We know that content that you can scrape off the web is really not as valuable as it used to be, because now this tech can scrape the web pretty easily. The big differentiator is differentiated content and data. We had this conversation with PayScale, who had a really big announcement this week about some of their tools. One of the things I really liked was a Compass tool that they had launched this week, that was focused on sort of an executive reporting, dashboarding view of a sort of a rolled up their data set. But again, much like us, PayFactors, or PayScale, sorry, that has PayFactors, their big, thing is their individual survey data that you really can't get just by scraping the web, right? Liv and the team at Findem have done sort of that same thing, aggregate a lot of different data sources that you'd have to really figure out a different way to sort of get it. That would be a lot harder, and plus a lot of additional data sources that don't end up on the web that they've got inside there. So all really exciting stuff to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll also mention that we don't know the terms of the acquisition in terms of the amount of money, but one thing we do know the amount of money for is what was given to Origin. This one's pretty interesting, right? So this is Origin, as we've mentioned before. This will be an AI benefits platform, employee benefits. I know there's a very famous software company already, so I always have to bring this up as a consummate nerd. But this is one that I will say, complimentary to Stacey. I think you first started bringing them up over a year ago, probably through your personal connections with Chris Bruce, as a company to watch out for on stage at HR Tech. And here we are now. They have now raised $50 million over the last 12 months with another, what they're calling a Series A plus, where they've raised $30 million on top of the $20 million that they've already brought on. So this is clearly something that is being seen of value by a lot of groups. There is, I think Notion Capital is probably the largest investor in this group, but we also have some big names like Acadian Ventures and Felix Capital, as well as some angel investors. So, and HSBC, Innovation Banking UK, in this round. So, some big names that are, no pun intended, banking on this being something of a lot of value. And it'll be one of the first sort of, AI originated benefits platforms. There's certainly platforms that already had AI, but to quote Chris Bruce directly, he said that it simply was not possible without AI to have created the company.
Yeah, I think this one is really, like you said, I've been talking about Origin for a while. every once in a while, I think, because because we know how complex the world is, we can see those tools that are just gonna hit. We did the same thing with Compa. We said Compa was gonna take off, and it took off pretty rapidly. Charlie Frank and his team have done an amazing job there. But with Origin, it's funny. Acadia gets into those, but I don't think they're investors the first time we're talking about both of them. So let's just say that to our good friends over there. But I will say that the thing that Origin is doing is, because again, Chris Bruce had created and this is international benefits, right? An international benefits platform a while back, and sold that to Mercer and it very effectively. What he's doing here is a view into international and overall benefits, so people can understand their spend, where it's being utilized, all of that kind of data, which is a lot harder to do. And particularly he's doing it through AI because basically they're reviewing contracts usage, all the documentation right now that's kind of was so hard to get to because it was locked up in kind of PDFs and things that were just not easy to access. A lot of their magic is in OCR technology, right? And so I think you will find that there are organizations who are focusing on the harder parts of the business are going to get the most out of AI, especially if they do it effectively, right?
That's right. Yeah, I think, we've mentioned this before. We've definitely moved away from this idea of we're just sticking AI on everything, right?
Yeah.
Just because we need to let's solve actual business problems with AI. And I think this is also interesting because you had brought them up, like I said, over a year ago, maybe, rather than just sort of rushing to market. They're building up and really trying to focus on the what maybe not as sexy as some of these other ideas, but the idea of that visibility into that spend and basically the ROI, which has been a big sticking point for some AI companies. And to say we're focusing on that first is very interesting and telling, I think.
Yeah. And then another organization I think that we are mentioning here, and I just noticed the notes got cut off, so I will re-add those back in, Cliff. I'm not sure.
They're back now.
Are they back? Okay. All right. I was like, all right, where did it go?
Is NovaWorks the company you're speaking of?
Yes. Yeah. So I had the great opportunity to get a chance to talk to Melanie Luget, who is now their chief product officer, as well as have dinner with Kelly, who is their founder, who used to work over and founded Hitch, which was acquired by ServiceNow not too long ago. And what I really like about what's going on here as an organization is that this is brand new, fresh. They just launched it right at the Transform event. So Kelly Steven Wass. I just couldn't get her last name out, but she's the co-founder and CEO, along with Ezra Vandenapu. Cliff, you're going to say that name better than I am, who is her co-founder and CTO. But Kelly has successfully exited, I think, 2 organizations previously, sold them out to organizations. This is basically, right now, it's an AI-driven sort of self-service solution, an employee self-service or manager self-service or HR service delivery solution that is focused on kind of managing the entire workforce, which includes your human workforce, your agentic workforce, your contingent workforce, and all the other solutions in between. It is native AI. It is built off the ServiceNow framework platform. And I'm very excited about where this might be heading, right? There's other opportunities, I think, for it to expand into a broader HR solution. Right now, it's very, very agentic focused and sort of understanding how all that works together. What was interesting was in seeing sort of the conversations happening in the market. NovaWorks is a really good example of the kind of, I think, ingenuity that we're seeing happen in HR right now, right? Which is the idea that we are seeing organizations rethink how HR works, which you and I have talked about a lot. Not just because what we do doesn't change. You still have to manage people, the roles, but how HR works. I think the biggest difference maybe that, and we're going to talk a little bit about later, is that HR might be shifting into their next big thing that I don't think they've really been able to ever get to effectively, is that they are managing work versus just the people who do the work, right? And we'll talk about what that looks like a little bit later in a couple other articles. But at the dinner that I had the first evening with Kelly and her team, and as well as a couple of founders, or a couple of investors and some CHROs, we had this great conversation about sort of what is the work of HR. And it was very clear that I think everybody had a different opinion about that too, and how much that was changing. And so it was good to see that I think people are not just improving on what we have these days or coming up with a new AI coach or a new AI learning tool, but they're really thinking differently about what work gets done within an organization. And that I think is the new conversation here, right?
Yeah, and I'll throw out there the other name you were mentioning is Eswar Vandanapu, who is the CTO and the co-founder along with Kelly Stephenweiss. He also started Hitch before going over to ServiceNow with Kelly. So they sort of have a proven record of doing this. But I'm going to give him a shout out as well.
Yeah. And I do want to say, I think that the goal is, yes, they're building on ServiceNow. It's going to give them a group of existing customers right out of the bat as a primary platform, but they are building all the AI work on it as agnostic with the goal that they can port that over where needed to other platforms and stuff.
Another big name, along with ServiceNow is Workday, and that Sana is now in general availability. So that's pretty interesting. We've had a lot of in-depth briefings, so much so, Stacey, I think you and I were like, have we not talked about this on the show? I think we brought it up, but if you're a Workday customer, you can jump onto the Sana platform. This one is interesting because it continues a conversation that we sort of saw put on hold, which is the importance of skills, and now has just rocketed to the forefront. When we do that overview of what we talked about, skills is going to be up there. It was already towards Q4 of last year, and now we're seeing that continue. So much so that, obviously Workday's making that investment, but it's also interesting to see just how they're trying to put that into the flow of work, right? So, having it available across all the tools as being sort of as non-obtrusive as possible during the demos and the looks that we have had at it. I think that is what they're going for here, is to just make it accessible rather than just sort of a separate platform you have to get into. And obviously it will have a very large agentic model as well to help connect it across all of the disparate Workday platforms, kind of getting it, hopefully helping grow this platform cluster model that Workday might be struggling with a little bit. Hard to say.
Yeah. And the setup of this is very no code, low code with workflow models and everything. I think the one thing that Workday is going to have to be very careful about, I think we're hearing it very clearly in commentary online, is the cost issue. Yeah. We're hearing over and over again, people are not thrilled with the costing model that is happening around a lot of this technology. And especially when the current system needs some updates. And I just can't emphasize this. Do not let your existing technology sort of get waylaid by AI technology being layered on top. I think that is the worst case scenario you're going to find, because your customers really are going to say, so I'm paying more for this, but I'm not getting, because the idea is that the AI will supersede and outpace the needs of what's happening at the functional level. But you have to have both working very effectively right now for the market to be comfortable with what you're doing. We should mention that Oracle put a similar announcement out about their multitude. I think 22 was the number, but I could be wrong. But there's a multitude of agents in their new environment. But again, with the development environment, right, where we can develop those agents, move those agents around.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that pricing model coming up too, how that's going to work. But now comes the segment that seems to keep recurring that we're going to call Cliff trying to describe something visually to our podcast listeners. Even worse, we also obviously are on YouTube if you want to watch me visibly struggle at trying to describe something that only I can see, because we've got a couple of rebrands. Now, this one, Clear Company, is rebranded Clear Co. So I think that is more or less obvious, right? You can hear the rebrand. It is shorter. They've also kind of gone with this interesting, I'm always interested in like the colors and where to get this. So it's interesting, Clear Code, black and white, and it's sort of got this sphere that you can see through. I think that's a clever idea. I think that's what they're going for. It's clear there.
Clarity was the conversation here. They were really going for clarity in message, clarity in talent management strategies. And I got a pretty good glimpse of this one because they did the launch while I was at Transform with them, delivering this session with them. And I actually really like the new colors, the new layout, because it is very distinctive from what else is going on in the market. The rest of the market's pretty flashy right now. A lot of pinks, a lot of purples, a lot of blues. This stood out in the room. I will say their engagement at the exercise at the, which I believe they're probably going to do at other events was by and far one of the best. The only one that beat them out was maybe the puppy station. They had a sand pit where you could dig through and pick out diamonds. Well, they had a couple that weren't real, but 3 people a day, each day won 3 real diamonds that then were set into some jewelry settings. And so I can tell you, and again, all around their clarity, messaging, the amount of people who were excited about that booth opportunity was pretty huge. But it really did lean into where they're heading, which is if you have clarity in your data, if you have clarity in a combined talent approach, you're going to have clarity in your ability to give your company a better view of workforce planning, a better view of strategizing, and more importantly, in these days and age, all of that stuff is important. But to get to there, oftentimes you now need AI and AI agents built on top. They have built in quite a bit of AI native content inside of that, all with the idea that we are focusing on being clear and clarity around it. So I thought it was kind of a cute way of putting it all together. One of the better ones done, and I'm not just saying that because I was there and Kirsten and I had a lot of conversations, but because I have seen a lot of them where it's just a color change or something, or a few small pieces of change. They really put a lot of thought into this, right?
Yep, and this is not at all, that was not a segue into this next one.
Oh, no. We like salary.
Salary.com has done a color change. Just kidding. Salary.com is also done a rebrand and have launched their Max. I think they're not calling it AI, but intelligent layer. Their Max tool system that'll be across the entire layer of all of their data. So you're able to sort of pull in, the agentic model, you can pull in, do real-time looks as things change. This is especially important when you think about the volatility of costs and things right now and how that could affect pricing in different areas, right? You want that real-time sort of model. So that makes a lot of sense. Salary.com will still be called Salary.com, but the logo itself is just salary with the dot at the end. So it looks like a short sentence, salary.
Yeah. This one, we got a little bit of a preview of that Max model when they were showing us their AI approach, and I was quite impressed with it. Salary is another one similar to the other ones that we've mentioned where they have proprietary data that no one else has. The way they sort of manage it, the ontologies they put around it, they've really leaned in heavily to skills. But their AI, so their Max model with the AI combined with it, I always like the way Salary's been setting up their AI where they have kind of the ability to sort of pick and choose your big buttons of things you want to do. You've got your write-in message, and then below that it keeps like digging in so that you can keep digging into the data with questions and options it gives you. Our good friend John Sumser, I think, worked early on with that with the team when they were developing some of that. And I really do think that they have created a nice approach to AI inside their environment because of it. So, yeah.
Pretty interesting news coming out of Deal, who have added an ATS, an applicant tracking system, so for talent acquisition. So pretty neat. They had their conference, which is called Big Deal, but spelled in their way, of course, in 2026 when these were announced. So expanded platform. The ATS is pretty interesting, because it will have the candidates already in the Deal platform from the second they're, even in the recruitment stage. So that works with their IT capabilities, right? Because you can use that for equipment, compliance, and as part of their mobility platform, they have Deal Mobility. So that'll be a system record for your I-9 or any other immigration forms, visa tracking, and right to work across over 100 countries. And then one that I think piqued both of our interests, which is they've redesigned their mobile app. That's not the interesting thing, I don't think. Good for them, is that they now have crypto pay. Employees can now receive part of their salary in stable coins. Those are your ones that are usually pegged to USD. I think that's actually one of them is USD coin, or so I assume they're doing those ones as opposed to like Bitcoin, so that theoretically you could pay people in different jurisdictions without having to worry about certain other things. Anything with crypto is always a little interesting to me, especially for a company that prides itself on its IT and security. But perhaps those things go hand in hand. But maybe I'm just an oldie because I was like, crypto, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we do see outside the U.S., particularly in regions that have unstable banking systems. That is part of what crypto was originally, after it got past the sort of Ponzi schemes that were built around it. Originally, what it can do, and I've talked to a lot of people who have these environments set up, it's a way to pay people when there's no stable financial model in the market, right? And so I do think that they're looking at that as a continued sort of opportunity. I think Deal, we did see them at Transform, the big booth there and everything. The more interesting thing I think outside of that is that they're truly expanding that entire platform because an ATS is a big thing to add. Generally, most
Hmm.
organizations
Hmm.
partner with that, right? So they really are trying to be the all-in-one. I think a lot of people partner with them for global payroll because they do cover some of the regions that other people don't, particularly Middle East, African areas. We might see how long that happens before someone wants to start to find other partners because that's a big risk when you really start doing everything that's going on in the market. Opportunity too, right? Like I think people are like it when they get as much as they can under one umbrella. It's interesting that they went out with an ATS over everything else, right?
Yeah. So, you speaking of that sort of global aspects, this this is going to be a rough segue to that, but Visier has launched a global partner program. So the idea here is to build out their ecosystem, right? So, they'll have go-to-market programs. They're going to highlight innovations through their partners, do help with sort of the user experience and the experience that you would come from the Visier platform going to any of those to sort of help maintain all that. So this is fascinating because this fits right into this idea of the cluster model. They are clearly bought into the importance and the need to create not just here's some connected companies, but having we always talk about the importance of bidirectional data transfer in these cluster models, but it's not just that, right? You want it to have a certain experience. You want people to feel pain from leaving the network, the classic sort of walled garden there, but also incentives to stay within, not just for the user, but for your partners as well. And I think that's pretty interesting. I would say fitting for a company that prides itself on understanding all of the information that's out there.
Yeah, the platform cluster conversation was a big conversation this week at Transform. We heard it a couple different ways and into a couple different places. This one I think is a really good opportunity to think about. Like you said, it's not just the tech itself. It's not just even the two-way directional conversation or that they're on a marketplace, right? It's that relationship you're creating. And that relationship includes every organization has to feel like I'm getting a win-win out of that situation. There's something for me and something for you. If you make it too painful, that's just not going to create a good, friendly relationship. It's definitely not going to create a good experience for the buyers who are trying to part with you. So Visier, I think, is leaning into things like additional incentives, leaning into different specialized solutions that are focused on things that their customers are specifically asking for, industry-specific plug-and-play innovation, like those are the kind of things that they're putting in here. And I really think this is a good direction for them because Visier is one of those organizations that also is a big part of other people's ecosystems. And so you really have to think about that very, very carefully, right?
Yeah, and I think also one, it shows that they've been working with a long time because they specifically call out allowing these partners to leverage Visier's workforce AI solutions to connect talent to outcomes. Don't know where they might have heard that phrase before. But, joking aside, this idea of taking these AI platforms and actually proving the value of it, that is the next step. And they are quickly jumping on that as what can be the value that they bring is say, look, which of these tools could possibly actually add value to your organization rather than just add capabilities. So you briefly touched on this idea. This one is of special interest to us, but I think it should be of interest to a lot of people. This is from Qualtrics. They've added synthetic panels. What does that mean? More or less what it says on the tin. These are panels, meaning groups of quote unquote people. Normally when we say panels, we would say this is a group of people that we would go to and ask a certain set of questions to, right? You would want them ideally to be made up representatively of the larger group that you're trying to get information from. Sorry to get to survey wonky, but this is kind of important because we're going to talk about the capabilities and roadblocks as well of this tool, but it still is interesting. So they have made synthetic panels, meaning they will be AI, artificial intelligence, probably in its truest sense, of saying this will be a representative sample of a certain group of people. And let's say you ask them, how many of you have bought running shoes in the last year? Rather than going to a group, you would go to this panel and you would say, I want this to be representative of Americans between the ages of 20 to 40, right? And then 60% of them said they bought in last year. And you go, okay, now then of course, the $1 million question, quite literally $1 million question is that accurate? And I will say that Qualtrics is very direct about the limitations of the system and ways to work with the system within their own public site of saying, here's the type of questions you can ask, here's what you can expect, here's how we would expect you to use this for your best possible outcome, and also be transparent that if you are sharing this information that came from AI and not from humans. When you say 70% of people, like you might hear from us, we're always careful, 70% of respondents say this. Then you would have to say, okay, well, 70% of this synthetic panel said this. But it was pretty interesting. And Stacey, you actually said that you had some very spirited discussions with some investors.
Yeah, to both the positive and negative. I mean, it was a dinner I had at Transform. The great thing is that some of the conversations start off with the questions of the vendors, the young vendors with new solutions in there about how much they were using AI generated engineering, right, to move their company forward fast. And the short answer was we are, but there's a lot of risk in that, and that there's a lot of mistakes in that, and actually costs us sometimes a lot more than it does to do some of it by hand coding. And so they're working through that. AI is definitely part of it. They have said, but there are some risks in there. The investors, and I always love this, you get these investors, not saying they're not great and amazing, I've got insight into everything, but they're like, well, I was able to build this whole entire thing that managed all of my investments in one day, using using Claude, and then using OpenClaw, I connected it and did all these things. And my question always is, so did you actually do it for more than one person? Did you have more than one organization using it? And that always kind of falls apart then, because there's a very big difference between creating something for you or a small set of you and what you would roll out to multiple people around the world. This is the same thing I always tell HR professionals as they are making decisions to develop an AI for themselves. There is a lot more behind the scenes than you give credit for than just that front-facing interface, right, to most HR technology. Synthetic surveys came up because then they were like, well, we're also doing testing, bot AI or survey takers. And I thought, well, I've heard about it. Yes, of course, we know all about creating personas, a persona to check your marketing, a persona to check your CEO language, those kind of things. They're trying they're doing the synthetic data. They're using their own, and they've created their own, I should say that. They're doing an actual panel that they are purchasing, and they're seeing how well the data comes out. Now, the one thing that I noted with them is that even with Qualtrics, but particularly with any of these sort of larger GLD, those guys, right, who are doing panels, you don't have first of all, you do not get a named participant generally in those panels, right? So you don't know who they are. Very unlikely oftentimes that you would even get the name of the company that they're working for, right? And so that, I think those kind of panels work really well if I'm trying to get consumer decisions, like I'm talking individual consumers of buying shoes, or what we're going to see in behaviors in healthcare investments, and things that are an individual human being that you can then kind of round up using a lot of socioeconomic data, where they don't, I think, work very effectively. And believe me, we tried, because it's a lot easier than our distribution process. Our distribution process is a massive amount of effort for us to manage every year. We've looked at panels and we've started panels. We could not get the level of data that we get today on our survey with panels, as even live panel human beings. With synthetic panels, I think it works, as noted here, with very distinct, like yes, no questions, perception-based questions that we have a lot of psychology data on from the internet and the web. I don't know how effectively it works on understanding companies and what companies are going to do, because if we knew what every company was going to do at any level, right, from a forward-looking perspective, that would give you a great Fortune looking forward kind of model. But companies are made up of a lot of different peoples and a lot of different decisions, and sometimes they follow regulations, sometimes they don't, sometimes they do this, sometimes they don't. It is much harder, as we've seen, to predict a company decision versus an individual human decision. So I think that's one of the challenges. I think the other challenge here is really if it's one thing to say that, well, we think 70% of the time it gets it right, and that might be okay with what shoe is going to be bought. Maybe I put both shoes on the shelf and I put a few more of the one that we were seeing more likely to get bought. But if I'm doing an awards program, or I'm doing a selection of a major technology that's $1 billion in my company, do I really want to trust that on, or make that decision on a synthetic data set And are you as a buyer okay with that? So I'd love to know the audience's,
Yeah.
perspective on this. Are you as a buyer okay if a synthetic organization tells you that they like a technology better than you, or that they would buy a technology because of what everyone else said? Because that basically means that the historical data would be the precedence then, and newer tools would get a lot less play then, right?
And I think that's just it. It's one of the reasons Stacey and I often bring up our practitioner background, because it's one thing to say, yeah, 60% of companies have this benefits platform or whatever the case, but we both know that oftentimes those decisions are made by, especially at small businesses, well, that's the CEO's cousin, or that one is just, we had a bad experience in the past. We don't use it. There's organizational sort of preference or memory that can't really ever be predicted, even by randomization, because there's just the people factor really does matter.
Combined with the business, right? Like I think
Yeah.
that's the piece that I think is the big part of that.
But that being said, like you said, there are certain types of questions where we're basically just using it as a mathematical model of saying, yeah, give me, knowing what you know, what do you see as being likely for this particular thing? Will people use this one thing? But it still is very interesting. It does show a little of creativity of the concept of AI, which many of them draw on, like random forest generators, right? Which is basically like, most likely it's going here, but there is some randomization, right? So that you get some sort of factors put in, and that sort of decision-making model does come closer to reflecting how humans are, rather than just an if-then sort of decision. So I did like that. So speaking of decisions that have gone wrong, though, one of the bigger news stories that I would say normally we wouldn't probably cover here, but we've been covering the concept of the metaverse within emerging tech for the last 10 years. And that is, which you probably already know, that Meta is shutting down the metaverse. The thing that they changed their name from Facebook for, only wasting $80 billion of money. CEO kept his job somehow, but
I got to give you props for this, because I kept this on the survey. I kept saying, Meta is going to, and we are seeing virtual glasses and UX grow rapidly, right? So I was like, Metaverse, but I even asked in our session this week, because I had a lot of manufacturing and companies. I said, so how many of you are using augmented reality at this point to do training? It was all the rage, right? Just a few years ago. You told me it wouldn't last. This is one I didn't see. Our data did show us it wasn't going to last. I should have listened to my data, not
not me.
boring development side going, this is so cool, we should be using it. We know the glasses are making a comeback, but there's some tweaks that need to be done before this gets there, right?
Yeah, and keep in mind, this is just them shutting down their virtual reality world, the metaverse that they have. That doesn't mean that virtual reality has been shut down. They weren't the only ones using it. I remember seeing some use cases literally over a decade ago from Cisco, not the food one, but the IT and provisioning, of being able to connect to virtual environments for things like helping surgeons be able to make these sort of, really look around in a VR setting, even when they couldn't make it to the hospital in time, and help advise, or people training on what to do during nuclear meltdown, right? Where it's not really something you can simulate, but you need people to go in and be like, go do this, quickly, and get their muscle memory. So it's not saying that it's gone, but it's becoming about use cases, which AI will as well. Mark it down. I said it. All those boosters. Yep. Remember who's told you the truth.
That is right.
But we've got only a little bit of people news this week. TalentNet has brought in Vish Baliga to their advisory board. Vish Baliga, you may not know the name, but you certainly would know his works. He is one of the founders of Fieldglass. SAP acquired over a decade ago, right? 2014. Yeah, we're not old. But that's pretty interesting. Kind of interesting to see. We're getting more and more of these sort of companies coming in. And it's interesting, too, because TalentNet, has also expanded their sort of AI sourcing model that we talked about a little earlier with Find'em. And so this is still of a lot of value, especially as the world of candidate sourcing becomes more, you'd think, in the sort of post-monster world that it would be consolidated, but it's actually the opposite. There's more and more places where you find people. Obviously, LinkedIn is probably number one, but you need to have multiple areas of being able to grab a sort of consolidated group of people. And another one where we're seeing a good use case of AI, so there's a good segue as well, of searching for all of the areas where you would find possible candidates that match, that go beyond keywords, right? That actually have the skills necessary.
Yeah. So there's some real connections there for what he's done in the past. It's always interesting to see when you get someone who has a track record. Can I do the second time, right?
Exactly. And then friend of the show and friend of ours, Paige Lefevre, previously at iSolved, has joined Daxtra. We're staying well within this talent acquisition space. I guess that was the theme. I didn't see
all the thing today.
So Paige Lefevre is now the global VP of marketing at Daxtra. So after, I believe, her entire career at iSolved, has moved over there and jump in title, which is always great to see moving on. We're sure she'll do very great there.
Yeah, we're big congratulations for Paige. We loved her over at the iSolved area. We're excited to see what she does here. It's always good to see our friends kind of get into new roles. There's a couple of other new ones I think that came out this week in Transform, but we'll be able to announce probably next week from friends who are moving into new roles. So yeah.
I should also mention that it's interesting that we sort of allude to a couple things that we know that are under NDAs. We're like, oh, maybe we'll mention Clear Company. That was what it was about. It wasn't that big a deal, but
I did mention that we had mentioned them that way, Cliff, in there. I was like, we hinted at it, but so yeah.
Exactly. So we were just mentioning Meta, and they're just having a very good or very bad, no good day or week or whatever you want to think of it as. That they were found along with YouTube, parent company Alphabet / Google. Liable in a California social media addiction / harm to children trial. It was pretty interesting because that, along with some other cases that have come out, I believe there was one against X / Twitter as well, have really this may possibly open the floodgates towards this larger conversation about liability for some of these tools. This is especially important in the AI world. And Stacey, you went even farther than that when you were talking about this, that really it's a huge factor in future SaaS and tech as well, not just AI.
Yeah, for years, and due to several earlier sort of judgments, we have basically said if I put out a technology, Facebook, all of them have been able to, the technology that the content is on is not liable for the content or the work that's being done within it, right? And this kind of mixes that picture between functionality. So basically, they've been very clear that Meta's being held accountable for its functionality that it put in place, because that was very clearly associated with addictive personalities, and they actually built it towards that, versus the platform, which has always generally been protected. That's why we have, there's been a lot of, freedom of speech and pornography and challenges around those things, because the difference between the platform and the content that's on it. Now, enterprise systems and SaaS systems have always kind of walked that line because they do both functionality and they do content. Are you held accountable for what it does, what it says, where it's at, right? And this opens the door for some of the bias and some of the as a possibility to sort of lean into what we're seeing with the Workday lawsuit going on for their recruiting technology. It also leans in a little bit to some of the things we've been talking about, which is how you have to be very careful about AI coaching, AI performance management, AI even learning on some sense in this bench. How much do you trust that AI agent to do those things in a world where you might be held accountable for what that AI agent is doing because you built that AI agent to do it that way, right? So.
Yeah, and actually that's interesting. So there was one from the National Bureau of Economic Research, and we're getting close to the speed round, so I might unofficially call this a little bit of that. But this was called Firm Data on AI. They actually, the NBER has released a few papers on this recently, and one of the authors, Nick Bloom, Stanford professor, did a nice summary, and some of it was about what you'd expect and in line with our own research, in that individual AI usage is rising, and that among C-suite, especially CFO and CEOs, usage was around 75%, but it was only 1.5 hours a week. Now, I would argue, if I were pro AI, that actually proves its value, that they're not, if they were spending 20 hours a week on AI, then it would be like, well, then what's the point? But what was very interesting is that CFOs and CEOs reported little net impact on productivity over the past 3 years, but yet they predicted large positive effects on productivity, expecting to go almost 1% a year. And I'm like, based on what? But I guess that's all they're reporting, is that people expect it to one day be valuable. I'm going to throw in a little caveat, as I want to do, that the actual data center capacity has dropped significantly, meaning you've probably heard of Starlink and a few of these others. That had been steadily growing. The idea that we're going to build these data centers that will be able to actually power the current and next generation of AI. But that has dropped significantly, lower than it had been for the last 2 years, in fact. Last 3 years, sorry. Meaning it's basically, we're saying we're going to stick with what we have, because these things usually take about 2 years to spin up. So it's not going to be that rapid growth. I think besides the most hardcore of AI boosters, most people have understood that, like, we are now in this holding pattern of figuring out what is the value to our organization. Where's that ROI? That's the word of the day if you want to go crazy. Pee Wee Herman fans rejoice. But I think that that's kind of proof of it, because, right now this is all either being subsidized or coming through private lending. And eventually, if we're saying 3 years have not shown us any value, it's going to be hard to get investment for those next 3 years, despite this idea that it'll add productivity. But that's why one of the reasons on the show we talk about use cases, just on and on and on, and hammer this idea of what is it you're trying to solve? What is the business case that you want to help with? And then you will find some value. And then you have to make the decision of what will that cost be, because that will definitely be something. But
all about it's going to be the balance. I always tell everyone, I'm like right now. Yes, AI is the story. The conversation will be, can we afford the AI, which we've been talking about for a while.
Yeah. The government stuff here, yeah.
Yeah, and as we move it, so one of the big announcements that was made at Transform, I thought Samara did a really good job. Jaffe, who runs Transform, and Callis, who's her partner, did an amazing job getting this announcement built into their event, along with the our REIST, which is the company that did some of the work for this. But basically, Taylor Stockton is to make sure I get the Chief Innovation Officer of the U.S. Department of Labor, was on stage. He works for, many of you probably know Keith Sunderling, who we have known for a while, who's the Deputy Secretary of Labor. He works underneath him. But he made this big announcement that they are doing. The initiative is basically Make America AI Ready, which was a texting training program that they're rolling out to every American that will do 10 minutes a day over 7 days that will help you understand AI. Now, I'm happy to share the text. It is, you text to 20202 and you will start your own 7-day, 10 minutes a day training session. I had a good conversation with Mike Bollinger, who is a good friend of the our REISTA organization. I did not get a chance to go over and talk to the REISTA team, but they do sort of this great sort of texting training model. It was interesting. I had a bunch of manufacturing leaders there who were talking about how they have to work with their labor union contractors or labor union workers, representatives. Sorry, get the right words right. It's the end of the day. They basically said the only way they talk to them is through texting. So they were actually really excited about this sort of text message training. They were actually going to go back and give it to their labor representatives. But this, I think, as I put in my note, I mean, it was a great announcement. It is nice to know that we are investing and doing some neat things like this. I always have, will there be proof in the pudding? Will this get people interested? I don't know. There's a long way to go, but definitely we are seeing it double down in the government. Now, at the same time, we had conversations about a lot of AI for trade businesses, grants and tools that are being put in place by both the government and private sector. Our panel, we talked about Libby making a investment in, I want to say, the Illinois area. They're the pharmaceutical organization. They're basically giving every university in the area a grant to do AI training for students, specifically focused on sort of that healthcare space that they are in. And that was an interesting conversation to see how they're giving endowments and grants in that area, because they're very worried that we are just not going to have the capabilities here in the States that we need to do this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, these next two stories are pretty interesting, and they relate very much to AI as well. And they're kind of talking about these big shifts that are happening because of that, right? We talked about the government influence, but something that you sort of alluded to at the beginning too as well, just the idea of transforming just the concept of work slightly in the world of AI and just how this should all work. So there were two stories, one called Who in the C-Suite Should Own AI from the Harvard Business Review, and one called The Case for a Chief Work Officer. That was in Time. And both of these are interesting. I had not heard this term that you told me about, which is forward engineering. But the idea being that, if we're using AI, does that fall under the chief people officer? Is there supposed to be a chief AI officer role, which we've seen? The HBR article specifically calls out ones at Dell, Pfizer, and PwC. This idea of a chief work officer sort of encompasses both. Also,
it encompasses both because one thing we're very clear of is that IT still needs to do IT, right? Mm-hmm. But yes, you are right. It definitely has this feeling that there is a role of someone who looks at both agents, contract workers, employees, which is what we just talked about. Sort of NovaWorks is looking at, right? That chief work officer language, and it was a language I was sort of throwing out all weekend just to see what were people thinking about it. Definitely resonated much better, I think, than I know people have loved the chief people officer title for a long time, but I think the chief work officer might be a new one, right?
Yeah. And it really gets into this idea. We did a special episode once with the gentleman from Work Tech Advisors and talking about this idea, which we've definitely brought up before, is this idea of just work tech rather than people tech, or what does that look like? Because, at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to solve business problems, and we use the entire tools that are in front of us. So I think that would make sense to have a role that oversees this idea, right, of getting it done, right? And having that separate, obviously, than a finance officer. And so, Stacey, I know you've been here for a while. Our listeners, thank you, and viewers have been here for a while. So let's get into the speed round if we could.
Yeah, real quick, I do want to make a call out on these two articles we're going to mention, just to note that Athena, just a shout out to Athena Karp from Workday. She's actually, I think, highlighted in both of these. And I just want to say she was one who shared them with me for the work that they're doing in sort of architecting and really fundamentally working at a deep level with their customers on sort of how AI gets used at a very functional level. And some of these came out of that dialogue and the work that they're doing around that. So I just wanted to shout that out on those. I also need to make a correction. I said Libby. It was Eli Lilly, the Lilly's Fund, for which makes a lot more sense now that I'm like, the medicine company. I'm like, Libby. Again, been a long day, guys, so bear with me. It is the Lilly Endowment Fund for artificial intelligence in higher education. So was that. So let me just make that.
Okay, but also long week, Stacey. You, like I said, you did the traveling. You've been in Vegas, which will
our favorite place.
But you having all these insights has been really great, because instead of just being like a disembodied story or something that we're just opining on, you're like, no, I talked to them directly, and here's what's going on. Here's the conversation that's happening. And as Stacey mentioned earlier, but we love to involve you guys in the conversation, you all in the conversation as well. So feel free to jump in. Many of you do on our LinkedIn comments. We always appreciate that. And for the speed round especially, because we won't get as much time to talk about it. So if you hear something here you'd like to know more about, we're more than happy. So one, we just talked to them today, and I just thought it'd be fun to bring up, is a new company that we met with called Huckleberry that does AI-assisted executive, but possibly expanding out coaching, right? Of almost in a very personal sense. You literally talk and it talks back. One of the few that do that, so that you could, bring up some things you're trying to work on, communication styles, advice, or just development. So pretty interesting. I think both Stacey and I were both intrigued by the name, which is cute, but the origin of the name, which actually comes from Tombstone, 1989.
I got it, 1993. Yeah, close
Val
to
Kilmer,
it. Yeah, Doc Holliday, Val Kilmer. I'm your Huckleberry.
The idea being,
you all know it.
Yeah, but the idea being like the concept, the saying, I'm your Huckleberry, is I am the one that can sort out what you need. I'm the person for the job. I'm just right for you. So that was pretty interesting, and good to see that they kept their colors. Speaking of branding, in that Huckleberry color. Since we mentioned SAP with Field Glass, We'll also mention SAP indicated they may go to use-based pricing. We've talked about this briefly, but we've seen it from a few other companies. We know we've talked about Oracle doing it. SAP we just talked about.
Workday doing it, yeah.
So this idea being that with the cost of AI, if you truly feel it's worth it, because like it is subsidized, and these companies report that they lose money oftentimes on these queries, how do they sort of start to recoup that value? Because at the end of the day, it is a business. So you will start seeing more in that. I think the conversation will be, how does that usage model play out with the idea of tokens? Is it API calls versus just queries you make to the system? We've probably all seen some of these horror stories of, I set my agent to work on something and overnight it cost me X much. So how do you put guardrails on that?
The other thing I think that we should note here is that CEO Christian Klein also said they are planning to tackle. Am I on the correct one?
Yeah, Klein is the CEO.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure I was looking at the right link.
Is the SWAT teams sort of?
The SWAT teams, yeah, the new SWAT teams that will help customers to adapt. It was the same conversation I had with Athena over at Workday.
So this is the forward engineering.
This is the forward engineering, yeah. So Cliff's going, well, how are you connected?
Yeah, I'm supposed to know.
Yeah, so this is this idea, and we've heard this talked about in consulting, but it really is the idea that I'm going in and I am not just telling you how to do it, I'm helping you figure it out. Right? I'm helping you figure out how you take all these little AI tools and make them work in your environment, which is what forward engineering is all about, which is doing more on the ground, building it out with you instead of sort of telling you how to build it out or doing it from the ivory tower somewhere. So, yeah.
No, that makes a ton of sense now that I hear the term, because, normally the engineering happens in the background, right? We sit in our companies, we've done this engineering. Instead, it's forward deployed. We're there with our customers and we say, now, what is it you need built? And you're using our engineers. So, no, that makes total sense. See, now I'm learning. We're all learning. All the comments are going to be like, Cliff, you idiot. We already knew that. No, they're all very nice. You would never write that. I'd delete the comment. So then a quick update, really quick update on the Mobley versus Workday, courtesy of a friend of the show and wonderful human, Heather Bussing, who has did a nice summary. I'll try and put that in the notes as well. She did for HR Examiner about what the court actually did. And so I kind of looked over the order.
Yeah, this was pretty big. She said Workday moved to dismiss portions of the latest complaint by Mobley and some additional plaintiffs that were added to the complaint. So they got a couple things dismissed and a couple things not dismissed. So basically, we're still at a standstill on this, and we're still waiting on it. So the update really is that Workday was maybe trying to say some things weren't important in the case across the entire environment, or she had the arguments that their complaint should not be valid across all the people that were there, because there were some people that were saying that they were impacted by work, the damages that really couldn't be impacted by mental. It was more physical, and physical doesn't make sense with this environment. So there were a couple things that they did get thrown out, but I mean, the lawsuit itself is still going forward, right?
To quote Heather herself, TLDR is, here's what happened. And he said the TLDR is not much, carry on.
Yeah.
It's a lot of legalese, which I get really hype on and love to read about and think about, but it's also not my area of expertise, so I will move on. Thank you for that advice, Heather. Here's a fun one. UKG's got a new customer, and it's the Philadelphia Phillies, a baseball team, and they will be the official HR, payroll, and workforce management technology for the Phillies organization. This is kind of interesting because this is a pedigree from the Ultimate days. This is something Scott was really big about in partnership with Miami Heat specifically. And we first started seeing, and I could be wrong, but as far as I know, they were pretty much the first pure HR platform, not counting like an SAP or an Oracle, pure HR platform to start appearing on the big four American sports jerseys. And all of a sudden you're like, normally you see, Nike, and all of a sudden there's UKG or Ultimate at the time, UKG. And then they sort of moved away from being like, oh, that's not going to be our thing. We're not going to be like the sports HR brand. And so this is kind of a fun little return back to the old days.
Yeah, for those who knew the old Ultimate headquarters down in Florida, they had a basketball court. You would walk in, it was a basketball court right in front of it.
I still have like a bunch of Pat Riley stuff. They were good friends there, right? Story that came, basically, this is from Gad Lebanon and written this thing about how men are leaving the U.S. workforce based on some census data. I saw a lot of census data that had dropped, U.S. census data, I should mention, and people making various assumptions on it. The net migration was down, and that's because Obviously, immigration has dropped out, and so we're sort of losing people across the board. There's also been a move away from doing the classic school to work thing, mostly because, well, there's a lot of reasons. This is me wearing my analyst hat, because school's too expensive and you're not getting return on investment. It's one of those things where you can look at a data point and extrapolate quite a bit out of it, but you got to look at the whole. It's one of the reasons why our report is almost 400 pages now. And now that I said that, I realize it's going to be longer than that this year. So let's move on. This one, even though it's in the speed round, this was one of my favorite articles here. And I think this one I'll definitely link. It's called the L&D Navigator, and it's broken up into a few parts. So this is part one. But what this really is kind of giving some imagery and a metaphor around this idea of how we are approaching AI and this new idea of work, which has been sort of true throughout. I kept wanting to refer back to this because you were kind of talking about this earlier, Stacey, and there's some lines in here, but they're kind of using this idea of navigators and how you learn to navigate by the stars and figure out where you're going. And the increase in technology doesn't mean that you don't know how to pilot a ship anymore, right? If the idea is just to read a bunch of numbers off of a GPS, you've lost the core concept of what we're even doing here. There's a line that I liked quite a bit, this idea of the conversion trap. And I'm just going to quote directly. This is reaching for AI-assisted design tools whilst leaving the underlying logic of our work untouched. It feels like progress, but it's mostly acceleration in the wrong direction. Meaning, if the core idea of why you're doing the work, if your processes and everything else isn't fundamentally sound, and this is the same problem we've seen with AI tools, we'd say it doesn't eliminate bias, it just speeds it up. Same idea here is that you're using these tools, but you've missed sight of what it is you're trying to get to. You missed sight of where you're trying to land or, where you're trying to navigate to. And this imagery continues throughout, and I think it's very lovely written.
Yeah, it's written by Laura Overton, who is a really good I should say not a lot. She's a friend I used to talk to a lot when I was in my learning days working on things back before we got really busy with the HR tech space. So I haven't talked to her in years. But she posted this I think is based off a book that she had launched with Michelle Ockers. And I just, I thought I really like the navigator model. One, my granddaughter lives in Hawaii with my son and my daughter-in-law. And there's a very big culture there, obviously, Polynesian navigators going from island to island. And part of that is the journey is as important as the destination in that conversation, right? How you are doing it, the symbolism of it, the experience of it, right? And so I do think that we do have to consider as we're going through this entire process of a general new technology is what journeys are we going to lose, and should we build those back in some other ways, right? A really good experience on this is when we first put in e-learning back in the day, the idea was, we don't need classroom anymore. Everything's e-learning. We just do it as fast as possible. And we pretty quickly learned that the human connection was critical until you end up with still a lot of classroom in certain cases, right? Where at what point we get to that with AI. So I think there's some of that, right?
Yeah. And speaking of learning, there was a pretty good post, Howard, you kind of summarizing a few different books, 4 different books, and titled it How Organizations Lose Their Minds from Circuit City to the 2026 AI Layoffs. I am blanking. There was another book that came out in 2025 that was a lot about the impact of private equity. But the idea here is that, using the Circuit City example, which has become the new one, I think, after Blockbuster, of just like, not pointing and laughing. That's where Daniel at work there, but like cautionary tale. With the idea being, you cut people because it is a short-term measure to get you into profitability, but that has extremely long-term impacts. And there is a direct line. It's just not just as simple as, we cut some people, but there's a few other things. It's very obvious that by cutting key people, you're unable to meet the demands of the workforce. At that point, it's kind of, you're dead in the water, right? You're just floating there. And they use a few different examples, and this has happened on and on, whether it be Twitter to the U.S. government, is that once key people are gone, basically it can no longer function as intended.
Yeah, it's a really good article, very well written. I want to say Kathy Pham, I saw her comment on it. I do not know the gentleman who wrote this, but you and I both, Cliff, read it. And we're like, yeah, this is worth a read if you haven't had an opportunity to. It reminds me a little bit of Kim, making the elephant dance of the IBM story, right? Like that's the opposite side of that conversation. At what point how do you make these changes in a way that keeps you alive, right? So yeah.
Absolutely. You know what? Maybe a bit of a bummer to end it on. So let's talk a little bit positively. Here's some fun stuff. Here's some people to bring you joy to where you possibly might already live. Where are we going to be, Stacey?
We're going to be in a lot of places. So April 13th through 16th, I'm going to be at Atlanta or at the Infor analyst event. So we can get an update on what Infor is doing, which we've been looking forward to for a while. Cliff, you'll be that same week in Florida at the ADP meeting of the minds, right? And then also you're going to be in April 15th and 16th at the Canva conference. First time we'll get a chance to do that in Los Angeles. You'll be flying across the world. I'll be heading out to HR Tech Europe April 20th through 24th, where I will be doing a new type of session out there, which is a little bit of a mini workshop model. So I'm excited to get to start that out with the HR Tech buyers and HR Tech professionals. That will be in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And then you will also be that same week at Workday Innovations in California. And then I'll be flying crossing paths to the Oracle Analyst Summit on April 27th through 29th in San Francisco. So we'll be going across the way. Cliff, you're also going to be at WorkHuman, right? April 20th and right?
Joined by your partner and co-founder, Susan Richards, who will be with me there. That one will be really good. And that will be another one where there'll be 2 in 1 week, because I'll be going up to Holmdel, New Jersey, to the Bell Labs, to the iCIMS headquarters to go to iCIMS one. Then we get a bit of a break, and then in mid-May, I'll be in Raleigh for the Salary.com, with a new brand, roadshow, which, thank you for putting a picture in this. I realize that you guys can't see it, but Stacey wanted to reiterate to me, or show me that it really is truly a roadshow in that they have a truck and like a van and trailer with the logo and the wrap, and they're coming to various towns. So very cool, we're going to do compensation conversation roadshow, Salary.com. Sean Luentes and Andrea Derler from Vizier will be joining us as well. So really excited to get that in the books. Yep. And then in June, I'll be up back to San Francisco, the new Vegas, I guess. I wish that on anyone, to visit with Rippling, which would be very interesting to see you.
San Francisco's a little bit better than Vegas. Not that we don't enjoy our Vegas time if you get to the right location. But I mean, Wynn is much better, let me just say, than Caesars or some of the other events. I'll take Wynn any day.
Well, they're what our customer contract with Caesars.
I know, yeah.
Sorry.
All right, guys. I know we are way over an hour today. As always, we know we're supposed to be cutting this shorter, Cliff. I'm going to blame it on you this time.
Yeah, please do. So this is even making it longer. But usually there'll be ones where it's like, we may get time to talk about this, and that just means no, we're not going to have time. But there was those ones like the L&D Navigator where I was like, this is just too perfect. It wraps everything up, and it's too interesting not to share. But that's the problem when everything's interesting, then you are in there. And I've heard from a few of you that you sort of skip around. I'm not mad at that. Just make sure you just skip to my jokes. So that's 10 seconds of content.
All your jokes are worth it, Cliff. I'll tell you that. All right. That's it for this episode of Spilling the Tea on HR Tech. We hope it's been just the brew you needed to start the engines running this week. I just want to say a thank you to you, Cliff, as well to our production team, Brand Method Media Group, run by Kelly. Also to our marketing team, Summer Alano, Cole Harris, Linda Galloway, the whole team, Caitlin Diamond, who get everything up and running and on this. Thank you to our listeners and communities. We couldn't do this without you. If you want up-to-date news on immediate breaking HR Tech news and getting all behind-the-scenes content from all the things that we're doing, be sure to follow us at Sapient Insights on LinkedIn and Instagram. And that's it, folks. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another pot of boiling hot HR Tech updates and insights. Bye, everyone.